Hi everyone. In this episode of the Zero Hiccup podcast, I'm hosting Sanjay Vyas, Executive Vice President and Head of India Operations at Paraxal. Sanjay's career has expanded for over 2 decades, and with a wealth of knowledge and insights that he will be sharing, we will be exploring how he navigated his career to reach such heights, the strategic vision behind Paraxal's India expansion, and the exciting future of healthcare and clinical research. Stay tuned for this interesting conversation and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Zero Hiccup podcast. And today's guest is Sanjay Vyas. Hi, Sanjay. How are you?
Good, Ayush. A pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes, pleasure is all ours, especially, having someone like yourself who has a coveted career of over 2 decades, creating a difference in the pharma and life sciences space. Really a pleasure to host you. And, looking forward to this conversation for the next 1 hour or so. So let's start from the very beginning, Sanjay. Why don't you give us a bit of background, your story, from where you started, where did you grow up, and before your current role, like what all other things that you have done or tried or learned. So let's start with some of those highlights.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Ayush. And I'm not sure if it's a coveted career, but absolutely, I'm humbled to be out here, and I'm glad if it can help some others inspire in that process. But just to go back a little bit of the humble beginnings, actually, I think, as I said, we're a family of three boys who grew up and born and brought up in Mumbai. Even though my dad and mom moved from Rajasthan, Udaipur to Mumbai. It's interesting. I always tell this. I like to relate a little bit to my dad's history. My dad was 9 or 10 years old when he moved to Mumbai, and technically, he actually used to work in a restaurant while trying to do night schooling and make his education. And as we were growing up, my mom always used to tell us a story of how he had gone through the whole process of working in a restaurant as a waiter and then trying to educate himself through the humble beginnings. I still remember when we started in Mumbai, and we grew up actually in a, you know how Mumbai flats are. They are like 300 square feet home, three brothers. Imagine we all trying to, but those were great fun because we were all used to like camp together in the living room, sleep together, watch the TV. One bedroom, small, and one kitchen. So, but that's the kind of stuff. But the good thing, I absolutely am blessed to say that my parents actually made sure that we got the best of our education. One thing he always taught me was the fact that no work is small work at the end of the day. And that's one of the reasons my career started as a paper boy. So I used to throw papers at people's home because that was the way I was trying to earn money during summer. Not that we needed it. My dad, we always fulfilled our wishes in terms of the school fees, the camps, and everything. But this was more to just get into the practice of what it means to get into a kind of a career and what it means to work practically, right? And through that process, actually, I've done my bachelor's in commerce and economics. I've done my master's in sales, marketing, and product management. So technically an MBA. But before I did my MBA, I worked for a couple of years because one of my mentors had told me that at some point of time, it's great to do the education, but at the same time, get some work experience before you get into the master's piece of it. And that's why I decided to do work. And then I did my part-time 3 years triple M program from the University of Mumbai through Somaiya Institute of Management Studies and Research. And post that, then worked and span the career across multiple service industries, ranging from pre-shipment inspections to e-commerce to dot-coms, where the dot-com was big into the boom and then it crashed. And then I had to pivot my career, got into supply chain logistics, then into life sciences over a period of time. I've lived and worked in 5 countries, 4 continents over a period of last 22 years, which I think I'm privileged that way, but also I feel the fact that it gave me a lot of multicultural exposure. So lived and worked in Chile, Brazil, Germany, Singapore twice, Hong Kong, India, obviously, where I started my career, and then landed up in US. And then after 18 years later, I'm back to my own country on an expat assignment. So it was interesting, like how the life pivots and comes back to you. But all throughout, I've spanned my career into service industry, because one thing that I always got excited about service industry was the fact that I'm able to envision a service. It's like envisioning a dream of a sponsor or a customer, convert that dream into a paper, and then convert that paper into a reality, which is what service industry allows you to do, unlike in a product industry, right? So somehow not against the product industry, but somehow the fascination of the service industry, which is why in the last 22 plus years, it has always been into different service industry, as I said, from pre-shipment inspections to .coms to IT infrastructure management to e-commerce to clinical research and supply chain and logistics in life sciences as well. So that's a little bit of the span of my career, Ayush. If that helps, I think it's a more of a bird's eye view. I think it'll take a lot of time if I go through literally every part of it, but I hope that helps.
Quick question, Sanjay, on this, since you mentioned you have worked in these different industries. For many of us, switching between industries is quite a difficult task or undertaking. So many people end up like, starting their career in one industry and they are just doing that industry. So, how do you, while your, career would be an anti thesis of that in terms of that, switching industries and probably, maybe connecting the dots between industries, what I can imagine. So, what is your take in terms of how to make that happen? Did you face any challenges like switching between industries, or was there uh, like a common theme that you were able to take from one to another, so that while you're, you could switch, but it does not hampers, in terms of your knowledge or understanding of that industry and so on. So, how did you do that?
I think it's a great question. Couple of things were continuing to motivate me as it. One thing I always get frustrated, Ayush, and this is something which I always talk to people, right? When people start recruiting people only for aptitude and not for attitude, right? And I was one of those. I was one of those individuals who have always believed that both go together. While I understand that in certain industries you require the kind of a skill set, and it happened to me once or twice. So when I started my career into pre-shipment inspection, which was great because it was aligned with my commerce and economics background, international trade, I was able to link up to this. But then I decided to pivot into e-commerce and .com. And one thing I realized over a period of time, this happened with one of the organizations that I was interviewing. I went through all the levels of interviews, and interestingly, I think I was the final two shortlisted, and I was having a conversation, final interview to just take an offer letter. And then they realized, oh, I did not have an engineering background. And they're like, oh, oops, as a policy, we have that. And I was a bit frustrated. I said, you went through 6 rounds of interviews and now you realize over a period of time that. So I said, somewhere the attitude itself was showing that I know the knowledge, I had the experience, but I was still. So I think that kind of also became a little bit of a vengeance for me. I said, at some point of time, I need to start getting myself outside of the comfort zone, and I think that's when I started stepping out. This happened probably at the initial part of my career, which is when I went from .com then to actually selling IT infrastructure solutions without an engineering background. And I think that's how I pivoted, and then slowly, once I got the flavor of that, yes, I can learn myself over a period of time, I can equip myself. So as long as I have the attitude to keep equipping myself, and what you call upscaling and upskilling parallelly at the same time, I think those are the two things I always tell people. And that's how I pivoted into supply chain logistics. And when I was interviewing for the DHL role, when I decided to get into supply chain, and I was talking, and I was pretty impressed. The CEO that I was speaking to was pretty impressed with my interaction. But I did tell him that I don't understand supply chain as much, and he only said it's not rocket science. And I said, okay, if it's not rocket science, then maybe I can pivot. So that was another big pivot and motivation that happened, which got me into logistics and supply chain. And interestingly, I started selling more of what you call retail automotive piece of it. And then later on, I pivoted to life sciences. Once again, the same question. Like many people said, you don't have a life sciences background. How would you be able to understand and position this? And I said, yes, absolutely. We will be, like as I said, as long as I'm able to learn and equip myself, I'll be able to do it. So I think those were my motivation factors, which is why I always try to put myself outside of the comfort zone. Even the last job or my current job with Paraxal, I had no background in terms of clinical research. I had no background in terms of how a clinical study is conducted. But what I knew was from a from a supply chain perspective, from a logistics perspective, how the drug supply happens from the finished product to the downstream. And my mentor told me once, if you know the downstream, it's not rocket science to learn the upstream of the drug development journey. I said, till you don't get into it, and if you get into it, your entire journey of understanding the drug development will be fantastic. And you should take the leap of faith. And that's when I decided to take the leap of faith from DHL, where I was heading the life sciences division, to Paraxal, which was a clinical research organization. And it was interesting. By the way, I had some struggles there, but I think it was an interesting journey. I hope that helps.
Sanjay, one of the things that you mentioned, is getting guidance from your mentors. Um, can we go a bit deeper into that? Like, what kind of mentors you have and how they have helped pave your path for career?
Yeah, I think one thing I always tend to tell people, whether they're at their initial, mid, or even at the peak of their careers, I think having a mentor or a coach always helps. And not because I'm saying because somebody needs it, but it is somewhere where you can always take an alternative opinion. But by the way, for me, a mentor need not be a formal person. It could be somebody that you can normally go out and discuss topics who have been either from the industry. I can tell you there are times when I am discussing with my 18-year-old daughter and asking her, like, this is what I'm planning to do. What do you think about this, right? I've done this with my wife several times. Even before I plunge into any other career, I try to have those conversations, because what happens is you get a perspective of how they think independently, because there's no influence on them when they're giving you an advice. But especially coming from my mentorship experience, I've always had a mentor or a coach, either within or outside the organization. And the reason for that, so for example, I'll tell you a little bit, going a little bit deeper. So for example, when I was trying to pivot myself from the role in DHL, which I was heading Singapore, the Asia Pacific for life sciences, doing pretty well in my career, not that I needed to pivot anything else. And when this interview happened with Paraxal, and of course, I had to go through 7 months of rigorous process. I met like 10, 12 people. And there was still a skepticism, right? Because I said, clinical research, yes, we have managed logistics for them, but have never really gone into a clinical research organization. And I was trying to ask my mentor, and my mentor told me, tell me what happens if you don't do this. I said, very soon you'll still be stuck up within the glass ceiling of the downstream of the supply chain and taking the finished product. You'll never understand how a drug development journey happens. Yes, will it take some time for you to learn? It absolutely will take some time. But then just imagine, and I think I would be, I'm really thankful to him for him giving me that advice, because just imagine if you're able to now understand how a molecule gets developed. And then once the molecule, before it comes to the market, the power of your knowledge of that supply chain, because the role that I was applying in Paraxel at that point of time was to manage the clinical supply chain, which is the upstream of the drug development. And it was much different. I wouldn't have ever understood that the complexity, because in a finished product, what happens is you're dealing with a product that's already known. The supply chain is set. You have already done parameters, right? You know what kind of temperature control environment you require to take that finished product. It's approved by an FDA. When you go into the upstream of the drug development, you're dealing with the unknown. The product is still not approved. You're still testing it on a patient. There is limited supply. You don't produce in mass. You only produce all that aspects of it. Well, he was trying to explain that. And apparently he was true to that extent, that I was able to learn all of this as a part of that process. Uh, but I should also tell you that these are some of the leap of faith, Ayush. When I joined Paraxal, and I will be pretty honest to tell you that 6 months into the job, and I was a little bit frustrated. And I was like, okay, there's a lot of acronyms and I'm trying to understand. 5 days into the job, I was the head of supply chain, and they invite me into the boardroom to make a presentation on the strategy of what the supply chain should look like. And I entered the room, and Ayush, you'll be surprised when I looked around, there were doctors, scientists sitting in the room, and I'm scratching my head. How do I make these people understand that how difficult it is to get a product to the patient at the end of the day and make it? Because for them, somehow a product magically lands at the patient site or an investigator site, and the things happen. But it was an interesting challenge, right? So that's how my journey started in Paraxal, with that first meeting, trying to explain to PhDs and scientists sitting in the room that how supply chain logistics would function. And I was pretty successful at that point of time. Not only my strategy was accepted, but then we have grown over a period of, it's been now 8.5 years in Paraxal. Unless I'm doing something wrong, that's why I've continued to make pretty good, and my role has extended 3 times now. But that was interesting. So that's where the impact of mentorship comes into play, that sometimes you got to take that leap of faith based on the advice that you get. You should listen somewhere that has been, like I always tell, it's a combination of head, heart, and guts that you need to put in place. The head will tell you the fact base of it. The heart will tell you this is where you need to plunge in, somewhere your heart gives you the calling, and guts is when you need to take that leap of faith as well. So I
Right.
hope that example helps.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Pretty much like what I've followed. What I say is the art, science, and witchcraft.
Yeah.
So some art, some science, and then some magic.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go deeper with these some of these thoughts. So one, like for the layman's, can you explain a bit more on, let's say, how the whole pharma industry works today? What is really happening? If you were to explain it to a fifth grader, like what's currently happening? What are some of the trending things you are seeing, and what the industry is looking up to? What's going on basically?
Yeah.
Like let's do that.
I think it's interesting because a lot of the factors, especially I would say COVID, has made a lot of people educate themselves of what a drug development is all about, right? There was a time when nobody knew what a clinical research was all about. The only thing people know was, yes, I go to a pharmacy, I get a drug, and that's it. How it's a what journey does a drug go through, and what the pharmaceutical companies do at the back end, the amount of research that goes into it is something which becomes a very unknown. And then suddenly it became a dinner table conversation. I still remember when people used to, like my family members, you started asking, oh, what's the efficacy? What kind of patients are you recruiting? What is the kind of output that's coming in? So if I have to subtly put it, I think pharmaceutical life sciences is a very huge industry with multitude of stakeholders that come to it, right? It starts with the development of a simple molecule. Now, that molecule could be developed for an oncology disease, for a hematology, for diabetes, but irrespective of the fact, whichever therapeutic area it relates to, the molecule has to go through a journey before it even hits the market and before it has been prescribed by a doctor or by an hospital or injected into the patient, right? And this is where the education piece needs to come into play. The molecule first needs to be developed. It needs to go through an animal testing for the safety and efficacy piece of it. And once the safety is proven, then the first in human study happens. And after the first in human study happens, it has to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 trials. And sometimes people don't realize that it takes anywhere between 3 to 7 years for the drug to even before it gets approved and comes into the market, which is where I think understanding the whole clinical drug supply cycle is critical. And then once the drug comes into the market, then how does that drug go from the manufacturing all the way till the pharmacist or to the patient's home, right? That itself is very interesting journey by itself. And there are multitude of parameters that needs to be taken into consideration, whether it is the ethical considerations, the regulatory considerations in different countries, the temperature environment control conditions that needs to be taken into considerations as well. So as I said, there are multitude of aspects as a drug goes through that. So if I have to tell you that this is one of the interesting parts about life sciences and healthcare. And as we are proceeding, there are some interesting complex journeys that are coming in. We are talking about now doing cell and gene therapy, CRISPR technologies, where you are able to manipulate the cell, inject the medicine, like your cell might react to a particular medicine differently than my cell. So we are able to now do a cell-based therapy where a time will come when the drugs will start getting manufactured for an individual rather than collectively for a group of people. And especially when I'm talking about rare
Precisely.
diseases and special diseases. The general diseases like the cold, cough, of course, that will continue to happen with certain streams. But that's the progression of the pharmaceutical industry or the drug development industry is what I'm talking about.
Right, right. And I see post COVID, even pharma companies are more visible, like be it be the social media presence or like internet presence or like trying to communicate with their customers. Or I see some of the companies even like now trying to build solutions more digital. So not just drug manufacturing, but they're looking at a digital landscape of their products where they are able to see how the customer let's say takes in their medicine or like what's the life cycle of the drug that they've created with the patient and stuff. Is that true? Like I'm thinking more as an outsider what I see, but is that true?
Um, I'm trying to understand your question. Maybe if you can just help me clarify a bit more, because I want to make sure I answer it appropriately.
So
So,
what I'm saying is that as a external observant, I see that more and more pharma companies are now visible and taking, let's say, an effort, as part of their strategy to go nearer to the patient. So is that something that is part of discussions that are happening, in the boardroom, that how do we get nearer to the customer? How do we have a branding of ourselves even? Because I think like earlier people used to just buy a drug saying that, okay, it's a fever medicine, for example. But now I see more and more pharma companies, are visible, like they
yeah,
they want to put a brand outside,
correct.
and so on.
I think what you now I get your point. So I think it's very interesting that if you really, it's a cycle of life that what I would say, or a cycle of the industry that is going through. So you're absolutely right. 10 years back, 15 years back, if you have looked back, the pharmaceutical industry was trying to target a disease, right? What has happened is that focus has gone from not only focusing on the disease, but what are the stakeholders that go through this disease. So and when I talk about stakeholders, it's not just the patient, it's the patient, the hospitals, the investigator sites, the doctors, and the nurses, right? Because there is a complete journey that needs to be completed for a medication to be induced into a patient. Like COVID was a great example when the pressure was not just finding the right vaccination or the right COVID therapies to save patients' life, but it was also a combination of how do you make the life of the doctors and the nurses, because they were also at stake at that point of time to deliver those medicines out there, right? So yes, in the boardroom, the discussions are now not just about how a drug is developed, but once a drug is developed, how is it going to impact the patient at the end of the day, but how is also going to help our doctors and nurses to make sure that those therapies become much more easier to be imparted into the patients accordingly as they go through. Which is where, as I said, that interestingly, another example I can give you. So when COVID happened, the biggest challenge that happened on clinical study conduct was everybody and everyone was focused on giving therapies for the COVID patients. All the hospitals were suddenly pivoted towards that. Now think of it for a moment. While this was happening, there were patients, there were other people who were suffering with other diseases, pregnant women. There were oncology patients who were at last, like they had started facing challenges because the beds were prioritized for the COVID patients over that. So, how do you pivot those situations? And I'll tell you one interesting thing that we did as a part of that journey was we started evaluating, and this is where the pharmaceutical companies and clinical research organizations came together and said, why don't we look at direct to patient? Like rather than having the patient come to the hospital, the patients who are not covered. So we actually worked with the regulators and the authorities to pivot our studies, to take the studies to patients' home so that they do not lose out on the regime. Because what happens is, once you're on a particular dosage or once you're on a particular medication, let's say especially oncology patient, and we had a similar situation where one cancer patient was coming every time from Malaysia to Singapore to get the dosage done at the hospital. It was going through a cancer study. This was his only last hope, right? And suddenly COVID happened, border shut down. Now what do we do? So we actually pivoted the whole medical protocol, and we worked with the MHRAs in those particular countries between Singapore and Malaysia, where we were able to ship the drug from our distribution center directly to the patient's home, send a nurse, and got the drug injected. That's the patient focus we're talking about. So that's just one example of how we are pivoting towards direct to patient. But as I said, the whole post COVID, the industry has started looking at proactively at immuno-oncology as well, like respiratory diseases. Like, what can we do proactively and not wait for a disaster to strike next time? So there are a lot of research that's happening now from an immuno-oncology perspective. A lot of new drugs are coming from that angle as well. Ultimately, this is like to make sure that in future, if a pandemic like this happens, then what is it that we have ready in the pipeline? The mRNA technology is a great example out of that as well. Like, if you really look at mRNA, right? People thought that mRNA was used only for COVID. Let me tell you right now, there are 50 therapies that we are evaluating and testing using the mRNA. So today, mRNA could be used for fever, mRNA could be used for, we are even looking at companies who are testing mRNA to be applied to oncology, cancer, therapeutic areas as well. So the invent of this technology, which actually helped us with COVID, is now been expanded to apply to other therapeutic areas as well. There are many such examples, Ayush. As I said, we can spend an entire day talking about the patient-centric, but I just wanted to bring those additional focus here, that how patient is becoming the center of universe right now.
Right, right. And another follow-up question to this: Are these trends uh, globally the same, or you see different things for India or in India compared to, let's say, what's happening in the US currently in the context of pharma industry? So, are there differences, like some very different strategies going on, or do you see that that's something to globally?
I would say it's a global trend. Interestingly, while I gave you an example of the cell and gene therapy, like where we're talking about extracting the cell and trying to create therapies out of that, and then inject that and take the cell back and inject it back into the body, right? Believe it or not, the first cell and gene therapy is actually on the play. IIT Mumbai, I think so, has worked on it. And it's bright to see there's one or two other organizations. Unfortunately, I can't mention the name because of the confidentiality piece of it. But Indian multinationals are actually started looking at experimenting cell and gene to the extent in one of the sessions we were speaking, the patient who probably had lost hopes on those aspects was able to recruit on this particular cell and gene study, and has not only recovered but is showing no relapse. If this goes successful, we are talking about some of these medications which otherwise would cost a bomb will be available at one third of the cost. So I would say the trend is very similar. The only difference is the magnitude. Maybe the magnitude is a little bit forceful in the Americas and the Europe, and I think that's because of the basic reasons of the infrastructure development, the ecosystem that's available out there for innovation. But India is getting there. If you really look at the kind of even the recent budget that was launched, the spend on healthcare is absolutely becoming pivotal. I think what impresses me in India, which India probably is doing better than some of the other countries, like this Ayushman Bharat digital mission, right? I sat with one of those guys who is probably the architect of this, and I was trying to understand what exactly that's you're trying to do. Like, the whole world is trying to find out, like, how can we get real world evidence and real world data and combine that with clinical trials so that we can get therapies faster into the market. The biggest struggle is the disparate systems. Every hospital has different electronic health records and other stuff. And even if they have it, the data is garbage in, garbage out. Like, how do you make sure? I think the ABDM is what it's called, a short form, the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, is trying to has created a middleware. It's pretty much like a blockchain technology that will probably sit above all the EHRs. It doesn't matter what kind of EHR a hospital has, as long as you're able to connect that EHR into the ABDM, will actually give you, me, and as patients an access to the data, and we can decide who do we share it with, right? I think this is where I think some of the aspects of India is probably trending much faster than the rest of the world. But when it comes to innovation of the new molecules, I still believe US and Americas are a little bit step ahead as compared to India. But the whole ecosystem with the new biotechs, I think the number of startups that you've seen, amongst that, I think almost 20 to 25% are biotech related, like are related to biotech as well. So that's inspiring. Now, how many of them will really be successful? I think it needs to be seen, because it's a long journey. And that's the challenge of this industry, because normally any kind of a new molecule takes anywhere between 3 to 5 years before it gets approved and brought into the market. So,
Right. So that you talked about startups. Let's touch a bit on that. So in the pharma industry or life science industry, what are some of the opportunities that you see where there's a good case for new startups or young companies to, like either replace or, augment the incumbents and create value?
I would, I think I have a very straightforward, simple answer out there. The biggest challenge today in India, and it's unfortunate. It's actually fortunate and unfortunate. The fortunate piece is we have become. People call India as the pharmacy of the world. You know why? Because we are probably the largest generic manufacturer in the world, probably after uh, Israel. Believe Israel is the second best after us from that. But the reason why we have been talked so is because the ecosystem helped develop us. We are great at waiting for an expiry of a product and then creating a generic version of it out here in India, right? Biosimilars is definitely better. I think where we are lacking is the ability to start focusing on new molecule. We have the best talent because it's the same time. If you go back in this multinational organizations, the people who are actually scientists who are working on these molecules are majority of them from India. The
It's
question
like
that
IT
I
services industry, like
exactly.
IT services runs the world.
Yeah, and that's what I said, that like why can't the same molecule development then happen out here? Why are we just focusing on biosimilars and generics? I think it's a great opportunity for the new startups to start looking at new therapeutic areas and molecules. Like you can throw out any therapeutic challenge today. Like let's talk about lung cancer, oncology, or hematology, or diabetes, or all of that stuff. All of this has a potential opportunity to start looking at new molecule development within the country, which is where the educational institutes like IISc and IITs are trying their level best. They have started incubation centers now and new startups out there. They're encouraging, but I think a lot more that needs to happen at a broader level. And this is where, so if you look back, what China and Taiwan did better, and the reason why many of that investments got pivoted and suddenly a lot of molecules started coming up because the Chinese government came up with a very strong investment policy. Even Taiwan, for that matter, came up with a very strong investment policy in medical devices and new molecule development. They got funded from the government because some of these investments go in multi-million dollars, right? You have to have patience in terms of trying to drive that. I think this is where, so I believe that new molecule, or what we call it as the NCE, new chemical entity development, is a huge potential opportunity in India across therapeutic areas. Cell and gene, CAR T therapies, CRISPR, these are fantastic opportunities at this point of time if you really look at for new biotech and startups. If I have to summarize this in a succinct manner.
Right. And I believe, India has a large market, especially, around, like the aging population or the chronic illness. Like we are, we like multinationals would look at this market to be able to sell their product.
Absolutely. If you look back, and this is, see, but this is again an irony, right? So believe it or not, when clinical studies are conducted, we would assume that there is a lot more patient population that gets recruited from Asia, Southeast Asia, because between us and China, we have 3 billion of the world's population sitting here out of the 7 billion, right? But apparently, less than 3 to 5% of the population in India participates in clinical trials. And it's not because there is so one is because there is a lack of awareness that needs to be driven. Education is particularly key. But the second thing is, at some point of time, due to unethical practices or malpractices that happened 15 years back, like somehow there is a little bit of a perception issue. The great news is in 2019, the DCGI came up with some fantastic new clinical trial regulations that has now completely put our clinical standards at the US FDA and European standards. But there's still a little bit of a slowness because one is there's somehow a mindset that we are not guinea pigs. It's not about being guinea pigs. It's about getting an access to medication. I was speaking to a patient who was going through a rare disease. We have a patient advocacy forum that runs out here, right? We invite patients because it's not just, we need to know from the patient's perspective what they go through when studies conducted, right? And when we asked them, they said, Sanjay, it's such a struggle that for my disease that she's going through, she can't even get up. She can stand only for 5 minutes. The rest of the time she has to keep lying down. She, at some point of time, she was a sports anchor. Now imagine the life of that patient. And today she says that my only alternative therapy that's available for me is in US, where a clinical trial is conducted, and that trial is not available in India. It's not because it's like, and this is the struggle that we have to fight through. And so more of education is needed. More of such conversations need to be brought. I think it's like there was a hashtag that was trending in during COVID when they said hashtag no looking back. What I said was no looking back was there was so much of new technology that was pushed forward. The direct to patient concept pushed forward. We pivoted so many laws, like what was becoming a standard suddenly became a variable, right? And we were able to pivot. And apparently we thought that this variability will continue, right? Unfortunately, post COVID, we all have gone back to the
Back to
traditional way of
status
doing
quo.
things. And this is the irony, right? This is the irony that we have to probably drive the conversations with. But I think more open conversations are needed, and we need to bring such more thought leadership on the table as well.
Great. So, switching gear and moving towards more on the strategy side of things, one of the things, Sanjay, your role today is, driving strategy. And I believe, like, with all these years of experience and expertise under your belt, like something that could be like second nature to you, maybe, something learnable for, other young learners and listeners of our podcast. So, give us a quick masterclass around strategy. I'll give you some questions. So, let's say if you were to plan a strategy for, let's say, new product development, for example, what would be the ways, or what would be how would you go about it? What comes in your mind? What would be the quick questions that you would ask to start with, or how would you approach it?
Yeah, so great question. And I'll talk with examples as well. We were trying to launch a new service within my past organization. And the first question that we normally ask is, I think getting the end user perspective, or the who is going to be benefited from that particular service, is going to be critical. So first is understanding what's the market, like understanding what's there. Is that really a gap, or are you just trying to create a service and push yourself into the market? I think this is where majority of the time the mistakes happen, because we think we have innovated a great product, but if there's no demand for that product, or there's no need, you're not. So addressing a gap is very critical. So first, understanding from a customer's perspective. So what we used to do is we used to conduct these customer forums in life sciences, just to get them into the room and toss ideas. Hey, we're going to start this medical express product. Is it really going to help you with the last mile delivery? And many of the customers said, yes, the last mile delivery is a big challenge in terms of having a cold chain medical express product. Nobody offers this into the market. Can you develop something? And that's how then first we take the feedback. So addressing the gap is very critical before you start developing. It's just not about, because normally we tend to get very excited about ideas, but the idea has to address a need or a gap. So that's one part of it. Second is, when you go back to the product development journey, also, one thing you also need to understand is, what is your current bandwidth in terms of the service portfolio that you're offering? I'll try to explain this in a very simplistic manner. You have a core business, right? Now, the question that I always ask whenever I'm trying to develop a product or a service is this going to help me with the core, or is this going to be adjacent to the core? There are two different aspects to it. Like, now the adjacencies are also very critical. Now, I'll give you an example. A clinical study is a core, right? But managing a clinical supply chain, because without a clinical supply chain, you'll never be able to get the drug to the patient, and the patient will never be able to get participate in a study. So the regulatory services are a adjacency to the core, right? Having an early phase unit is an adjacency to the core. But so the most important question that people need to ask is, when you're developing a product, once you've identified the need, is this going to help you with the core, or is this going to help you with the adjacency? Third, market sizing is very critical as well. Now, once you have identified that this is going to help me with the core, then the question is, okay, is this more of a cost arbitrage, which is going to help you sell your core better, or is this going to be more of a revenue arbitrage, where you'll get an upside on the revenue and it'll further add to your EBITDA, right? And I think that's going to be critical as well. And I think once you start answering these simple questions, then you can start formulating your strategy slowly and steadily. But those are the most key aspects. Understand the need, understand the gap, understand whether it's a core or an adjacency, understand how it fits within your organization, and do you have the necessary infrastructure to support once you launch this product, right? I think these are the top high level suggestions I can give you in a quick masterclass that I can talk about. Yeah.
Sure. And connected with execution side of it, as they say, strategy is one thing, but then it's all about execution. So how do you
Absolutely.
go about, creating a plan around execution, or, like having the checks that execution is happening?
Yeah.
Yeah. What have you seen?
I think one of the biggest failures that I always see is people are good at articulating a dream and putting it on the paper, making a PowerPoint presentation, but getting the PowerPoint presentation to realization. And many of the leaders actually struggle, including myself. I had one failure in my life, which is when I learned my lesson that I put a dream on the paper. We launched a product, and I tell you, the product miserably failed because we were in a hurry to get this out, and we did not do our checks properly. Right? It could be multitude of reasons, but I think the way to keep yourself on the track, one is very, very critical, that you need to have a very strong discipline in revisiting. Like I would call it as a project charter or a project plan. Right? What we do is normally, once we strategize, we try to first doing a prioritization. There are 20 initiatives listed in your strategy document. Are you sure you really want to go with 20, or do you want to focus on the top three first and then the latter three? And you have to give a timeline. Maybe the latter three will go in the next 18 months. The remaining 10 will probably go in the next 24 to later months. But these are the top three that I'm going to focus on. Once you have defined that top three, assigning a clear accountability and responsibility within your team to say that, hey, you're responsible for this particular product. You have to make sure that this strategy or this initiative gets done. These are your timelines, and having regular checks on that. And so what I would say, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, depending on how your governance structure flows into that, that discipline is very critical. The other important part while you're doing that, which people normally don't do, is pulling the plug. You also need to know that over a period of time, when you've seen a progression, you should know when to pull the plug out as well. Like, because sometimes you get, because, oh, I've already invested, I've gone through this process, but the moment you realize that this is something which doesn't seem great, it's not going to help you realize your strategy the way you had articulated, it is also important to call out the plug and go back to your management. It happened to me once again when I had to go back to the management and our board, and I had to tell them that yes, we were 25% through this process, and we just realized with the changing marketing dynamics or the market dynamics, I don't think this is the viable thing. We will have to pull the plug. Were they happy? They were not, but it would have been better off than waiting for the entire product to get developed and invested further more dollars and then gotten out of it. So I think as you track the progression, pulling the plug or continuing the plug is something which is very critical. Those checkpoints are going to be very critical, and asking yourself the question critically is, are we heading in the right direction? Are we going to hit the milestones or not? And if the milestones are not going to hit, then what is your plan B in terms of the deviations as well? And I think all those factors come into play, which requires a proper articulate project planning and monitoring on a regular basis.
And I can imagine, like, especially in your industry, where a strategy could be multi-year, it is very important to, keep, keep track with, let's say, the changes happening outside, or the, things that are changing and may not be in your hand. So pivoting accordingly or making deviations. So how, and but also on the other side, you may not want to change too often, for
Yeah.
example, because people would not like the change, and then again the checks and balances kind of like become obsolete if changes are happening, because people would
Yeah.
be like, okay, you change this KPI, now I have to start again, for example. So how do you keep that balance, or how, like, what's the frequency of change, or like, how often do you change, like, how do you manage all of that,
I
especially
think
the multi years that you are talking about?
no, you're right. And most of my strategy plans at this point of time in my career are either 3 to 5 years range,
Yeah.
right? This is what we're talking about. But having said that, in that multi-year plan, you also have what we call it as low-hanging fruits and what we have as the long-term piece of it, right? The low-hanging fruits are probably much easier to implement because you know that there is some sort of ecosystem that's there that's going to support you launch a new product, service, or probably an initiative accordingly. But on a long-term basis, you're absolutely right, which is one of the reasons why doing a detailed due diligence is very, very critical before you start on the journey. Your fact base has to be there, which is where do your research and research. That's what I always tell people. Talk to the customers, try to validate your soft product or soft service even before you start working on it. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Do you think something launching like this is going to address your challenge or your gap or not? I think all those validations are going to be critical. Now, having said that, in spite of such validations, you do reach a point sometimes you have to make a change. I am not a big fan of making those changes as often because you're right. There is an investment, dollar investment that a board comes. See, what happens, you have to understand as a business unit heads, I'm not the only business unit head in an organization. There are 5 other business unit heads that are trying to run a P&L. When I get a CapEx investment approved, I'm taking away that investment from someone else and for the organization. I think that realization is important for anyone as a leader, that it's not that a company has a huge pocket and they can just put their hands in and they can remove and give it to everyone, right? There is an allocation of capex that happens. And when that allocation happens, each one of us is trying to pitch a business. How do you think above the line and below the line is very critical. Like when you're thinking that, okay, while this particular product is going to help my business unit propel and sell my services better, but then how is it going to help overall the organization also? Which is why I think making that critical, keeping that in your mind as you're developing and getting onto the journey of launching any new service or product is critical. Which is why I said it's a combination of things. Changing ultimately has to be also depending. So for example, certain times you have to change the configuration of the way you're defining the service, right? Or way you're defining a product. Some changes needs to be brought in because the market has changed, because maybe there's a pivot from a solid dosage to oral form now. If that is happening, then you've started building up a clean room. How is that clean room now going to help pivot that requirement? Are you able to make that change, or do you need to shut down? Like I had to make a decision to shut down one of my clean rooms because suddenly the requirement of those thing came in. Unfortunately, it was after a long cycle of 1.5 year of investment. It's still there, but I'm still confident at some point of time I'll be able to reuse that for some other purposes. So your ability to put something to reuse also needs to be considered as you're planning through this journey as well. So that, as I said, multitude of factors, Ayush, out here. There's not one pinpoint thing I can tell you that this is how often you change, or this is how often. It all depends on which business unit. So I might have a completely different strategy for a clinical supply chain logistics versus a pharmacovigilance and safety versus what I'm doing here in India from a GCC perspective, right? From the growth strategy perspective. So
So, talk to us more about the GCC, strategy, because that's one of the things Paraxal has been making waves establishing the GCC in India. So, what made you get started on this GCC plans to, like execution wise, how is it going? What are some of the challenges if you were to share from your own learnings establishing this GCC?
I think the just for the audience's perspective, the global GCC stand for Global Capability Centers, because not many people realize what it means. Is I think at some point of time, 5 years back when I came to India, one of the things that frustrated me was people kept talking, "Oh, India is the back office," and I'm like, "Stop using the word back office," because I think at some point of time, India has reached a pivot. Or what you call an inflection point today, that we have the right skill set and the ecosystem that allows us to not only start looking at supporting, but also doing innovation from here as well. And that's where the global capability centers concept came into play. So and we came for a road show here with my CEO when he introduced me to the overall crowd, saying that, okay, this is going to be a new country head out here, and we were talking about it, and he gave me a chance to speak about it. And I one thing I promised to the team was, we are no longer going to look at India or Paraxal India as a back office, but it's going to be a global capability centers, and that's where that vision started.
So, you already had a back office until then?
Yes,
Or
we did have
but
shared services. So we did have
that
finance.
was outsourced to external partner, or you were already
It was a
owning?
combination of both. So we had some outsourced, some we had a setup. So which is where I think I was fortunate enough that we had some ecosystem that was already there, and that allowed me to use that base as a foundation. So not only did we expand, so today I can proudly say in the last 5.5 years we have. It's like a mini CRO in India now. Literally, like if you carve out Paraxel India out, it can actually stand alone function as a mini clinical research organization on its own. Name a function, it's present out here, right? From data management to clinical operations to medical writing to safety pharmacovigilance to supply chain to project leadership. We can literally run an entire study without having a single resource from outside sitting in this part of the world. And I think that's how the journey was created and we came up to it. So we are 6,000 plus people today. At some point of time, we were 3,000. So 3,000 to 6,000 has been a journey in the last 5 years, which has been pretty interesting as well. And I'm sure not only me, but a lot of these captive pharmaceutical organizations, if you look at the Novartis, the GSKs, the Sanofis, the BMSs of the world, all of them are now shutting up shops out here. Cost arbitrage is no longer the only reason why they're doing it. It's also because of the skill, the talent, and the innovation piece that's been driven from this part of the world.
And what are some of the challenges you faced while in this journey?
I think the biggest challenge is perception. Ayush, I think what happens in India deals, and I'm sure it's not just me, my peers in other industry also deals with the moment you, and it's just not India. I think it's a challenge with most of the developing economies or the third world economies. The moment you start looking at those, the first question, oh, the quality might not be great. You know, you will get good cost-effective resources, but the quality is always an issue. I think I had once this challenge and I had an interesting conversation. What I did was, and this is the way you probably need to address this, right? It is important how you present a solution. I pulled out the entire quality report of the global, the number of quality issues that were happening globally. And I said, okay, let's stop saying
Data.
blindly that India has quality issues. Look at this data. And believe it or not, India was probably somewhere 10th in the list when it came to the number of quality issues that were being generated. And I said, look at the number of people and then compare it to the size of the population. 30% of the company's population sits in this part of the world delivering you today. And look at then and that data was like an eye opener. And people were like, oh, you know what? You're right. Maybe we should like not just make blind statement. I think so. The biggest challenge is the perception. How do you continue to deal with the perception, address this perception? Every time it's an upselling for India. Every time you have to go and convince people that, yeah, the skill set is there, the culture is there. Somehow the other challenge, unfortunately for India, which gets compared to many of the third world countries, is the corruption piece of it, right? The ethical code of conduct. Not necessarily. India has gone through a long gone journey, right? It's no longer the, like, as I said, I don't even want to use that word, but people, the snake charmers country, right? It was something which happened probably 80 years ago. But today, with the kind of governance that's in place, like I'll tell you one thing. When the reason when I was sent out here was to make sure that I break the glass ceiling, I bring in the presence, and not only that, but also bring in that perception of the ethical code of conduct. And today, I'll tell you, with the speak up culture that we have developed within the organization, people are very open and honest to bring in challenges openly on the table and discuss on the table. There was a time when I had to, like I'm talking about 6 years back, yes, I had to go through a couple of challenges when I was trying to deal with it. But there is a way to address this. As long as you're able to take the tough decisions, I changed. Almost 35% of my leadership team was fired when I came in. But there was a reason for that, because somewhere a complacency had creeped in. Like, how do you deal with that complacency and bring that fact onto the table? But we are on a journey. Today, my CEO speaks very openly and proudly about what contribution India is making, and India probably is our best bet. And today, with everything that's happening with China, with Israel, with Russia, Ukraine, we have become the best bet to the world right now. Like, this is where the most stable economy with the skill set and the talent that's available. So all those factors are contributing to it as well.
Well said. So moving to a next segment, where I ask you a few questions around what's your hiccup. So, like let's start with what's one of the craziest thing that you've done to boost morale in your company? Talking about culture.
Couple of crazy things. I said not just one. There are times during COVID and pre-COVID, I've performed, I've danced on the screen so that I can motivate the people and be a part of that. I haven't hesitated dancing with them on my annual day celebrations and breaking the leg with them, which I enjoyed doing it. Sometimes being a part of the crowd helps because people look up to you and they know that you are
especially today's leader is all about being together, not
like you are the normal guy. You're not like somebody who's sitting in an ivory tower out there. So yeah, there are some crazy stuff that I've done to do that. So yeah, those are some of the examples. As I said, breaking a leg with my colleagues, open
Was that
hearted.
online? Like you were dancing online,
both actually done online and done offline as well. I actually even recorded a funny video, and I think thanks to my marketing team, so when COVID happened, we had to go to a virtual annual day suddenly, right? And virtual annual day, how do you get people engaged? I had to go to a studio to perform, getting out of a spaceship and coming down and welcoming everyone, which was a bit embarrassing for me. But I was like, you know what, I got to do it. Something crazy that gets excited, and people were pretty excited. They were like, wow, it's like, this is amazing. This is like a Star Trek thing, like trying to bring this on. But small little things, like when you do it with them, it goes a long way. So yes, I've done some of those crazy stuff.
So, share with us a funny or embarrassing moment from your early career days that in hindsight you can laugh about.
A couple of them. I've asked once my my CFO to get off the stage inappropriately, which I didn't mean it, but I was just in that I was anchoring a event, and it was an early part of my career, and then I realized, shit, what did I tell? And I used the word like, can you get down the stage? It's like, and then I realized, I didn't mean that. I was wanting to request him to go and join the audience, right? And this was one embarrassing moment. But there was one embarrassing moment I still remember. I was actually going for a big customer pitch. My CEO, my president of life sciences, was with me. And it's not easy when your CEO is joining you for a event, right? Because I had to go through 25 iterations of that presentation, because what was happening was every time and this was a big pitch for a $300 million opportunity. I was the global account lead for that.
Mm.
I had to send the presentation first to my CEOs. There were 7 chief of staffs under him who were validating. They were sending me. Then I had to send it to my boss, who was the president of life sciences, who was validating. He was traveling. He used to give inputs. Then again, I had to make changes. Again, I had to send it. After this back and forth, there was some point of time I made an executive decision. I know this customer well. I'm going to make certain leap of faith, and I'm going to put some slides, which I think I will be able to talk to, I can convince my CEO about it. And the final day came in when they all three were together. We were riding in the car. He was going through the slides, and there were the first 2 slides, and which were talking about the overall challenges of the sponsor. And the CEO looked at me, yeah, but we didn't agree on this. I probably will not be able to speak to it. I just looked at him. I said, if you can't do it, I'll do it. And my boss was on the wheels, and he was like, you didn't say that, like to the CEO of your organization. But what I meant to him was, and he says, don't worry, I am confident this is exactly what is needed for this presentation, because or else I was literally putting up my career at stake. And I said, I will do it. I want to do this. I put my foot down at that point of time. It was a little embarrassing, but I would say it's a combination of embarrassment and something which you believed in, right? And I think it happened. And guess what? That meeting was supposed to be an hour and a half presentation. It landed up being a 4-hour meeting with the presentation. And the CEO walked out and said, you were right. Those 2 slides were pretty important. But sometimes, as I said, that funny, embarrassing, and my boss literally told me later on, you almost put your and my job at stake when you made that statement, right? So I think those are some funny. But even today, I laugh at it. But and I'm still in touch with one of those ex CEOs sometimes, as I said, on Facebook and on LinkedIn. He once in a while sends me messages. He even today remembers me. But that's what has left a mark in his mind at the end of the day. So I could have lost my job that day if things didn't go well, Ayush. So
No, that's why these lessons become those milestones.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, so what's one of the most surprising learning in your career? Like something you did not thought probably that it is going to be such a big, impactful learning, but it became.
I would say failure. Um, Knowing my personality and knowing at the flamboyancy, you would have probably realized I'm very passionate about when I talk about something. In the early stages of my career, I thought I could do anything and I'll always be successful. I think facing my first failure was probably one of the most surprising moments and a pivotal part in my career, which made me look back. And it was not just about facing failure. I was bouncing back from that failure was the surprising piece of it. Because sometimes what happens is people take failure in a negative sense and they're just like, okay, now I just can't get up. It was a pivotal part in my career when I had to make a decision, and I almost actually I was fired. I was fired for that thing, which led to a debacle. Now, of course, not all organizations have the patience and the empathy to do that, but bouncing back and coming back with a vengeance was something was a big surprise. And then there was no looking back. So I would say yes, those were my first failure was my biggest surprise in my career.
Yeah. No surprise. In fact, failures actually make you learn more than successes, because success you take for granted because you feel, okay, I
Absolutely.
always knew it.
Yeah.
But then, failures stuck you. I think, a more rememberable
Yep.
as more memorable experience. So, continuing on failures, actually, like what was a major logistical hiccup in your supply chain, if any, since you have been, always about supply chain, and then how did you overcome it?
I could remember two. One was a launch of a Medical Express product that became a failure that I talked about earlier on. Uh, we literally launched the product and it got kind of stalled because we didn't take into consideration this product was catering to the courier piece of our business. We had three divisions: freight forwarding, supply chain, warehousing, distribution, and then the small courier piece of it. What we didn't realize that in a courier process, normally the customs clearance happens in a consolidated file. It's like a big yellow machine, like when the products are sent through, it's like it goes like a batch. And anytime you try to shake that batch and try to create a deviation, the process cannot take it. And we didn't anticipate that into consideration as well. So that was a big logistical hiccup that came in, that we had to redo the whole product and pilot it 6 more months before then we had to relaunch that product again. Thankfully, my leadership had the patience to do that. But imagine pulling a product that you already launched for a customer, and then now you have to pull it out, especially for a life sciences side, was a big logistical hiccup that came into play when we were dealing with. The other logistical hiccup, I would also say, was the fact when we landed up delivering wrong medical lab kits to a wrong investigator side, to a wrong investigator site for a different study altogether, right? So how do you pivot that and immediately take an action to recoup that? So we had to literally activate our what you call overnight white glove services to make sure that those products get delivered. But then that did have a cost impact because we had to eat up the cost for those perspectives. So yeah, something on those terms also have happened, which we have dealt with, but we have effectively solved it without impacting the patient recruitment, and we were able to resolve that before the patient came in. So
So, lastly, describe a hiccup, related to the international expansion. We talked about, you being a pivotal person, setting that whole operations up and leading it from 3,000 to 6,000 people. What
yeah.
was one hiccup that comes to mind, and how did you overcome?
uh, I'm trying to think of examples from the three P&Ls that I'm managing at this point of time, right? I think couple of that, I would say one of the biggest hiccup was a little bit of the cultural barriers, I think, which was one of the challenges as we were expanding, not just in India, but also there were other countries like Romania and Argentina and other places that we were trying to expand some of our geographical footprint. I think understanding the culture barriers is very, very critical. We thought it would be a little easy cakewalk being a multinational organizations to walk into these countries and start setting up but very soon we started realizing the labor laws, the constraints that we have, the kind of skill sets, what works well for Romania might not work well in Argentina. You can't have the same template. What works well in Mexico does not necessarily work well in India. So I think going back to the drawing board and trying to redesign the template to adjust to the local environment is something which was one of the major hiccups that I've seen in international expansions. But the same thing we have realized in doing some mergers and acquisitions as well. Sometimes integrating the cultures of two organizations put together, but how do you get people on the same level playing ground and buy into the common vision becomes very, very critical before you embark into journeys like that. So I think doesn't matter, but understanding the core objective vision and the goal and making people sign on to it with blood is very critical before you go in for international expansions. I think that becomes very critical because there always will be skeptics, but as long as if you're able to bring in that elephant in the room for an open, honest discussion, and templatizing that to meet the local needs as well is critical.
Oh, well said, well said. I like the line you said, write it in blood. Yeah. Well, this is all such a great conversation. Thank you, Sanjay, and I thoroughly enjoyed. Like you said, you walked that talk of opening up with an honest conversation. Enjoyed it. A lot of pointers that you made, I believe, would be very useful to our audience as they continue to build their companies. So one last question: what would be a great way to connect with you? Are you active on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on email? What communication channel works
Yeah, I
for you?
think the best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn and Twitter, both. I'm available. In fact, it's funny that I have an extensive network of following that I tried. And whenever possible, people do reach out to me sometimes for career advices. People do reach out to me for job openings. I make it a point, even if I am not, but at least I try to respond to each and every message I can if it's authentic and genuine, not just like somebody sending me hi. Like
Mhm.
have seen that. One thing I always tend to tell to I think the one thing I always tell the Gen Zs and the Gen Alphas of the organization is when you're connecting with someone, connect with some sort of a statement and a goal in mind and an objective and highlight what you're looking out for. Don't just like I've seen people connecting and then saying just hi and waiting for me to respond. I'm not going to wait back and respond to a hi. Like, what are you saying hi for, right? Sometimes I think sometimes people start using LinkedIn and Twitter platform like as if they're doing a WhatsApp or a Snapchat, right? They think a communication will come in, but I am absolutely available and accessible on LinkedIn networks. And I always tell people, I said, as long as you're authentic, bring your authenticity on the table. I will try and help as much as I can and respond as much as I can um, whenever possible. But that's the best way to connect. Yeah.
Yeah, authenticity is the way.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sanjay, and really pleasure hosting.
Cheers, Ayush. Thank you so much for doing this as well. And I appreciate connecting with you as well. Thanks a lot.